preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Joan Finkelstein. I'm the director of the 92nd Street Y Harkness Dance Center, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here tonight to our third year of the Breaking Ground series of dance conversations with Deborah Jowitt. Most of you have read Deborah Jowitt's criticism in the Village Voice and are familiar with her in that way. However, I have to say that Deborah is active in every facet of the dance world. She is a dancer, she is a choreographer, she is a writer, she is a historian, she is a teacher, and she has given immeasurably to our profession with her profound understanding and deep love of the art of dance. We are thrilled that she could be the moderator for this series for the third year in a row. For those of you who are not familiar with the Y Dance Center, we've been around for 60 years this year. We were founded in 1935 with a faculty consisting of Martha Graham, Hanya Holm, Doris Humphrey, Charles Weidman, and Anna Sokolow. Not too shabby, I think. And we continue to this day teaching adults and children, professionals and non-professionals. I'd like to say 2 words about Murray Louis. He's amazing. I saw him when I was really rather young, and he made a lasting impression on my mind's eye with his clarity and his absolute focus and the integrity of his mind and body. So we're really thrilled that he could be here tonight. I'd like to introduce, without further ado, Deborah Jowitt, who is our moderator and our friend.
This place is so full of history for me, and I think for Murray as well. I did my first performing as a dancer in New York here. I showed my first totally terrible choreography here, and I've auditioned here for the merry-go-rounders and then couldn't do it, and Murray has said that he made pieces for the merry-go-rounders, the famous children's company. Anyway, I'm honored to be able to talk tonight to Murray Louis. I saw him first with Alwin Nikolais' company back in the 50s. Truly remarkable, unique male dancer. I had never seen anybody move like that. I had no idea that anybody could move like that, particularly not a man. I was very prejudiced about what I thought gender differences were. I had never seen such flexibility or such a subtlety. And of course, I saw some of his early choreography and have over the years seen most of his choreography, most of his, he can't remember exactly how many, maybe we'll pin him down on that, but certainly over 110 dances since he began to choreograph. We're going to begin by looking, as we usually do, at just to get images in your mind, 3 excerpts from a video that he made in, I think, 1989 called Murray Louis in Concert. So first you're going to see Journal, the opening dance from Journal. These are all solos, which was made in 1957 and recorded in 1972. And Index to Necessary Neurosis, the Hysteria section, made in 1973, recorded a year after. And lastly, the Disenchantment of Pierrot, an excerpt from that 1986 dance recorded in 1987. So we'll look at the video, and then Murray and I will come out and talk to you.
Fast, in command of myself, thinking it took me 31 years to reach this point. Journal had a simple theme, a theme which every creative artist undertakes at least once in his or her career. It was, in a sense, autobiographical. It traced the path from first awakening to self-discovery, to lovesick youth, to physical exuberance, to psychological intrusions, and finally, to the sagacity of age. With Journal, I had discovered life. With Hoopla, created 15 years later, I had matured enough to make fun of it. Over the years, Hoopla and Deja Vu became two of my audience favorites. The Piper. Dark Corner. Persona. Yes. So. Show you this because of Debbie on this occasion I thought to take off my rubbers and make myself comfortable to talk with them.
Okay, so this is what they mean. All right.
111?
I'm sure that's okay.
Yeah?
Okay. Yeah. All right. So, Murray, one of the many things that interest me about you is that you developed as a choreographer, and as you developed, you continued to work as a performer with Nikolai, which is very unusual because most modern dancers, once they get their teeth into whatever choreography, sort of go off and leave their mentors. Yeah. But I'd sort of like to start talking a little bit about what it meant to be a member of that company, of Nick's company.
Yes.
In the 50s, because I remember the excitement about going down to Henry Street to see those works, which were totally unlike any work that had been seen in New York at that point. They weren't in the mainstream of dramatic dancing that Martha Graham and Jose Limon were showing, which we liked very much. They were very fresh. They were completely new. Well, what was it like to be part of that?
Well, I have to explain a little bit about Nick and how he came into the scene and how we met. I must say, first of all, that my association with Nick was a very long one, for almost 45 years, both personally and as a colleague. So this is what made it even more unusual that, in a sense, when we both became colleagues, we were rivals in the same profession. I mean, we had different managers to handle our companies. It was a very strong personal relationship that kept us together in spite of the fact that we were out after the same markets and the same opportunities as creators. When Nick came to the Henry Street Playhouse, he had been brought up not in the sticks, because Hartford in Connecticut was a rather major and interesting city, creatively, artistically, and this is where Nick was brought up. He was a Connecticut Yankee and came from a farm life. The terrible austerity of the Depression affected his whole life, and the tragedy which most people in the city had of monetary failures was even worse on the farm. And because at least in the city there were neighbors and things you could fall back on, and a farm you were, really, unless you were very friendly with your cow and livestock, there wasn't very much to fall back on, in terms of solace. But he, like all artists, you're going to be an artist, the first day you're born, really. I mean, by the time you're 6, you're something special in some way or another. Your attitudes, the things that, your predilections, the things that intrigue you. He knew he was going to be in the theater in some way, and he knew he was going to be a theatrical person. And I do want to define those terms later because too often, I'll define it now, the theater often implies, it covers too much. The word theater really covers too much. Either you deal with theater or you deal with drama. And too often the drama became the definition of theater. And that was a very small definition of the word. Nick was a theatrician. He was not a dramatist. But his definition, he fell into the category of theater. He staged not festivals really, but pageants that the church did and things of that nature. And although he eventually designed so much and influenced so much of the contemporary lighting and had its influence, everything in TV, when I see these things occur, I think, oh God, Nick did that so much better. Look at these guys with $1 million hacking away at this thing. And Nick with one
flashlight.
with more than...
5 flashlights.
That was a big opus.
Right.
5 flashlights constituted a whole episode. But he, for example, would take a tin can with a bulb in it, and at an earlier time, the Tootsie Roll suckers had colored gelatin kind of wrappers, and he would use those for his gels, and he would make a whole theater out of what he had available to him.
He had a puppet theater for a while, I think, when he was in Hartford, right?
Right.
He must have done everything for that.
He began as a dancer. He began as a musician. His basic background was as a musician. And then he saw Mary Wigman on a concert. He played at a ballet school. And one of the teachers there took him along to New York to see Mary Wigman. And of course, that changed his whole life, particularly because of the sound she used, the percussion she used. You have to understand, Nick was a musician as well. And the reason I make this point is that his electronic music also paved the whole way. His was the first Moog. When he met Robert Moog, he told Moog what he wanted Moog to do with that machine, and Moog did it. And then Moog became a great sensation with his machine because Nick designed it for him, and Nick used it and other things. He went to Bennington for several years in a row, worked with, I guess, all the great artists of that time over those 3 or 4 years.
Well, if you went for the whole summer, you could work with Graham's, and you could work with Humphrey and Weidman, and you could work with Holm.
And Martha Hill. He speaks
Martha
so
Hill,
highly
yes.
of Martha Hill, which is,
Well,
was
she
a
taught the
great
first
educator.
week usually, and the last week, and the others came in the middle, the guests.
She softened them to prepare for the artists, and then when the artists left, she told the dancers what the artists had done because they were left in utter confusion. She prepared them and brought them out of the trauma of meeting these artists. He had the puppet show in Hartford, puppet theater, for several seasons in Hartford. And then he went off to the war, the World War II. And when he returned back to New York, he knew he was going to back to Hartford, he was going to become a dancer. And he decided that he had to make his allegiances to one artist or another. He had his attachments to Graham. Doris had offered him a place in her company. Jose was forming a company, offered Nick a place in his company. But he found that his work with Hanya was the most amenable to his thinking. That Hanya dealt with concepts rather than patterns of movement. And this was a very tricky time in the dance because the drama that pervaded the subject matter of most choreographers was beginning to weaken a little bit. It was all very much of a psychological, particularly Freudian drama. And when Nick got the offer to go to the Henry Street Playhouse, which was 1948, Hanya had received the offer, and Nick was Hanya's assistant by then. And she asked Nick if he was interested in such a job, and he said yes. And he went down there, and I must say the Henry Street Playhouse then was really tacky beyond belief. It was a beautiful theater.
Well, it had been the old neighborhood playhouse, had it not?
And they had been gone from it for 20 years now. And in that 20 years, it had just deteriorated. It was closed up, and events did occur. The seats were wooden. The place was really terribly falling apart, but it was architecturally a jewel. And with anybody who could see structure and not look at mess, could see the possibilities of the structure of the place, the size of it, the scope of it. It was beautifully built. It was built on a hollow base, like an egg, so that the sound, it was built like a little European opera house. It was just a beauty. The Lewis and sisters did a jewel of a thing with this and shined it up, and it was wonderful. Anyway, when he got down there, he had to start some semblance of a school. This was how one sustained themselves in those days. You had a huge season of maybe 3 performances a year. Mm-hmm. We're talking about big seasons, right. You see. And the rest of the time you taught, or you did
neighborhood kids and.
Right.
But Murray, I'm interested to know what it was like for you, because you'd loved dancing since you were a kid, but you couldn't really study it. And then somehow, I don't know how this happened, but somehow you became a kind of a nightclub dancer. You did stuff, right? Yeah. And you met Nick at 1946, I think it was, at Colorado College, where Hanya Holm taught in the summers. 49. Oh, you met him that late.
That late,
I thought you
yes.
met him earlier. Okay, so you met him and you came back and you joined his company. Well, now here you'd been this, this Fred Astaire, that whatever you were aiming for. And
I was great.
Yeah.
I made so much money in that nightclub, and then I became a concert dancer and earned peanuts.
I was thinking that so much of, I want to talk later about how wonderfully Nick used you as a dancer, but a lot of his work, particularly in those days, involved the dancers being semi-invisible, behind things, under things. How did it feel? Did you feel as if you were suddenly your ego was having to?
No, I don't know how that concept really became. I think it was when he did those enclosed dances, and he didn't do very many of those kind of things. They were so startling that became his distinction, alas. But one didn't realize how much he choreographed for the body, fully for the body,
Yes.
Those moments were really rather rare. One of the things he insisted in his development of a theory called decentralization, his theory was that the center of the body had to be fluid. For example, in a technique class, you had to be able to grain all your attention. That was the center of my body. Now this was the center, and I grained totally to it. Now that was the center. Now this was. And to be able to fluidly move the center of your body, he expanded that into the fluidity of moving it through costume, through extensions, through sound, how to work with sound, how to perform, how to move out into space. That technique was a wonderful performing technique. Really, I mean.
Well, it created such ability, as you could see from the video, if you didn't already know, how Murray's ability to move, to transfer the center of attention to different parts of the body so rapidly and so fluidly that it looks like, there's something running around inside you poking out.
It was him. I think he really had a charisma that was startling, because that early company consisted of Phyllis, who was, I think, about 17.
Phyllis
Lam and Gladys Balin, who was, I think she was a year older, maybe 19. I was the old man. I was 21. And as a matter of fact, I really, throughout all the years with every company and everything to do with Nick, and I took care of everybody. I took care of him. I was the father. He may have looked the father, but I was the father. I took care of everybody. I looked out for them. The reason I did my work was most of that early company was so awed by him, and they did everything he told them to do. But many of them hated it, because he did place them in balance with the rest of the theatrical elements. And they really hated it, because dancers are so tremendously ego-oriented, They couldn't let their hair down, and they couldn't look beautiful, and they couldn't do this, and they couldn't do that, and they couldn't twirl. I mean, this was killing to a dancer, and he allowed none of this. And that was the reason that I choreographed simultaneously with him. And I gave everybody the roles they wanted to dance.
I was thinking that you from the very beginning, you would have these pieces where, which everybody had a little solo, and you kept that up.
Always.
But you had wonderful solos in his pieces, and yes. I think he was very influenced not only by the concepts of space that he got from Hanya and developed himself, but by your abilities and your body and the way it would work. But so you always had these wonderful solos, but you also spent your time, part of your time with the flashlights and
oh yes.
And I remember once asking Lynn Levine, who I had admired very much as a dancer in that company, a little bit about how she felt about doing Nikolais' work when often people would say it's, quote, depersonalized because there was so much work with props. And she said, I don't mind if I'm crawling around under a piece of fabric at all, because I understand what the total energy, what the total look of that is. And I think that that to be a dancer in his company, you had to have that kind of, not only your own ego, but a kind of selflessness that would contribute to that vision.
You know, Debbie, this really, what we had as a group was ensemble that was wonderful. And that was simply a definition of ensemble. We were ensemble with the sound, with the prop, with everything we were doing with each other. It was an understanding that this person lent to this person and that double energy did this. And it was a fluidity, because I think what made Nick unique was he didn't dance. Mm-hmm. So we didn't have to copy anybody. Mm-hmm. And that was very important. Mm-hmm. I realize now, I had to learn everything about performing myself. And being the old man of the company, they would always say, what does he want? What did he mean by this? And, you know, so I forced myself to be able to translate what he was doing and the way I would do it. Mm-hmm. And we had other wonderful people. I mean, one of the real jewels of that group was Beverly Blossom today. And he adored her because she was gifted. Mm-hmm. And when we would bring in by the way, it was a creative technique. After technique class, we would do improvisations, and then we had to bring in solos because we did our own concerts. He insisted that we would do our own concerts twice a year. It was really very arduous. And she always brought in wonderfully inventive material. Mm-hmm. We challenged each other. We were comfortable with each other. It was challenge, but it was never competitive in any destructive way. We were all so different. One looked to see how Gladys what she was going to do, what kooky thing Phyllis might bring in. Or Bill Franco suddenly appeared and said, I have a dance this week, you know. You just waited breathlessly to see this big, black, gorgeous thing do his thing. And Beverly with her kooky idea, and I had my own direction. And it was a wonderful growth. It was a family. It was really a family.
I think it helped, didn't it, too, to have that place. I mean, that was unique. People today would kill choreographers to have what they had, even if they had to do teaching that they didn't always want.
We worked our ass off.
But they had a theater. They had a theater that they could go into and rehearse from day one, if they wanted to, almost, of a piece. And nowadays, sometimes in Europe, choreographers get that, but not here.
Well, even there, you don't get it. Even there, the musicians, we had trouble with the music school on occasion. We were so much more important. Our egos were fed very beautifully, and we were so much more important than the musicians were. So we begrudged them their weekend of concerts, you see. But in European theaters, we were ideal.
Yeah.
It was.
And I think that showed in the company. I mean, I can remember going to visit Connecticut College in the old days of the American Dance Festival. I had a friend in the Limon company, and he said, come, let's eat lunch. I always eat lunch with Nikolais' company. They're so much nicer and so much more fun, and they're not so distant and so difficult as Limon's company. And I went, and I didn't know any of them. And Phyllis said, hi, this is your friend. Sit down. What's your name? I'm Phyllis. And I thought they must have a really happy performing life to be so secure and so. Who are you?
Yes.
They didn't do any of that.
But we really were isolated. But we isolated ourselves deliberately, and we just became those people down at we became Henry Street. We didn't even have a name. We were Henry Street. And that helped. Everybody lived in the neighborhood, and it was, part of home. Mm-hmm. Part of home.
It's funny, in those days, too, nobody thought so much of the home influence on, even though Nick always mentioned it, and
no.
But and I guess we were not well educated in those days about dance history. It wasn't something we thought about. Everything began and ended with us, or some. But I look at some of those program from early studies that Hanya's company used to do on tour, and there would be studies in things like attraction toward depth and urgency along a diagonal. And of course, it was done quite dramatically. But that sense of space, which came, I think, originally from Laban, that ability of using, I think Nick talked about using space as an active partner.
Yeah.
No matter how more abstract, to use a rather problematic word, his work seemed, that he had that sense that came from a real tradition, that he worked in a new way.
I think what he did about the idea of space, you must understand that, again, there was such a paucity of vocabulary to identify the various artists, to identify Graham, to identify Doris and Charles and Hanya. There was a need for, and they became labeled. Doris was fall and recovery. I mean, so preposterous. I mean, that was just one facet of her material. And Martha was contraction and release, and that was just one facet. And Hanya became the space technique. It was, it was this very limiting thing we put on each other for identification. And then gradually, like today, I mean, everybody deals with the vocabulary that Nick evolved. Now it's part of everybody's vocabulary. And you don't think of a technique being a specific thing now. It might be a style, but not a specific, a fundamental of space or time or shape or motion, things of that nature.
I think that was something that she herself, Hanya, felt was different about her. When somebody said, how do you consider yourself, this was in 1930-something, different, Miss Holm, from what Martha Graham and Doris Humphrey are doing? And she said, I think it's what I feel about space. If I were to say there was any slight thing that was different, because they had a great deal in common.
Yes. Hanya was really, I don't suppose, you see, it's so difficult, sweethearts. But those of you who understand the periods I'm rambling through, when Hanya came to this country, she came here in the 30s, and Hitler had just begun, and she was terribly self-conscious of being a foreigner and German after Hitler made his imposing, horrendous statement of attitude towards life. Hanya was always always felt a little bit on the outside. She was not an American, and it was difficult for her to talk about the American modern dance. But in reality, she embodied the most American thing, was that freedom of space. I mean, that was really what was ironic.
Yes.
That when she came to this country, she just went wild. She would go to Colorado Springs for 40-something years every summer. She would go wild in the Rockies and the plains of Colorado. She just adored this.
And I think her technique changed as she was here. It got bigger. And
yes.
Anyway, Murray, let's talk a little bit about how you felt as you began to develop your own choreography. Besides saying, I gave them all the dancing to do, it seems to me sometimes your work is very personal, and you've made several quite journal, A Fine Line, quite autobiographical works. Or even when journal, you were so young, you hardly had an autobiography, yet you were looking ahead to when you would have one. And Fine Line, he had, as I remember, placards talking about the different...
Every
decade, and he danced back and forth and ended up close to the 1990s one with a sort of, well, what do I do now? So I thought your works were very personal often from the beginning, your solos particularly.
I think they were more than... Nick was austere. I just have to talk about his personality. He was gregarious. He had a great sense of humor, but he was very German. And he could stand outside of things very easily. And my emotional makeup was very different. It was volatile. I didn't give a shit about a lot of things. I was very secure in what I was doing because I could dance and I knew I was good. And that security was marvelous for me. I never questioned it. And so when I began to work, I did whatever I wanted to do. Nick began to formulate ideas. And the horrible thing about formulating ideas is you're stuck with them. And he began to have to prove the ideas he was formulating, as anybody would. I mean, it'd be terrible if Einstein, after formulating that little bit of nonsense about space and time, suddenly discovered that they were divesting these in pinball machines. You could pick out, a little prize and open it up, and there the formula was in it. He would have been horrified. But he had to live up to everything he did, and so did Nick. I didn't formulate anything. I was very fluid. And I think that's what's kept me so supple and so really youthful, has been the fact that I never locked myself into anything. If I was wrong, I was the first to say it. I'd say, my fault, and I'd stop every argument. I was very cool about it, and that helped Nick's temperament enormously. That's why we were so compatible. I would never let him get inflexible when that situation might bring him to a point of view of being inflexible. Mm-hmm. I cooled it, and I said, that's it. Nick, you're not to listen to this, you're not to do this, you're that, don't. He would eat dinner with his fists on the table this way, and I would have to go to remind him to relax his hand at the dinner table. He was always in that state, mm-hmm. You see. So that when I began to work, I did anything I wanted to do. I would do subtle things. I read a great deal. I write a great deal. I think a great deal. I had a very profound philosophy with Spinoza when I was 16. I discovered my philosophy of life. And that was simply that you enjoy life as long as what you do doesn't harm anyone else. It was so simple, I couldn't get over that. I mean, here I've been plowing through books of philosophy, and here in one sentence, this was, and I came to the conclusion that there was no philosopher who couldn't, in 6 pages, say what they said in 600 pages. Mm-hmm. And that's why I don't read any of that stuff anymore.
Just like maybe they're choreographers who could say in 5 minutes what they take 50 minutes to say.
And that's succinctness. No, just do it. Say it. What is it you're doing? What is you saying? And I hope I deliver that when I teach. That same sort of thing. What? What are you doing? What are you saying? Just talk it out. And you find that in 3 words, you'll say what you want to say and then do it. This kind of a thing. Anyway, my fluidity, I would do emotional things, I would do funny things. The way I created was in a sort of a circle. I might use electronic music and do a non-objective dance. Then I'd swing to the other end of the circle and do something emotional to Bach. Mm-hmm. Then I'd swing over here and do this to this. And I go right across the chalk and do that to that. Mm-hmm. Then I'd go over to here and do this. And I deliberately would break up. So I never repeated myself. I just never did the same subject. Then after I had done 1 million dances, and I had to start turning out a concert a year, and let me tell you, 40 concerts is a lot of, 40 separate concerts is a lot of work. I suddenly discovered, my God, you can repeat works from the past. Oh, was that I never realized you could do that. Yeah. I've been brought up, you had to do a new concert every year. And I would repeat certain things. And if I thought I did them better in the past, I didn't bother repeating them. If I thought I knew more about a subject because I was older and hopefully learned more, then I would do it with another point of view. But I kept it very fluid, so I could not get labeled. I mean, I did get labeled. Quirky, that was my label. Hanya was space, I was quirky. And
it's sort of inevitable that people do that. Although I wasn't able to look at any of your group dances, so I had to rely on memory and the printed word. But looking at the solos, there's some that are very austere. just one part doing, that leg swinging, or I think the greed from, what's that from? It's a
Index.
It's an index. It's it's a very strong, muscular kind of solo. But I do think there is this little thread that comes through your solo work, which is you've done something called Little Man, and the clown, the Chaplinesque figure, the Pierrot, that
was part of that theme.
Wistful, charming. You have that. Somehow that's in you as a performer. It comes out, and you like to let it out. I think.
I think that's an important part of everybody's existence, is the ability to be wistful, is to enjoy not always operating, with all 16 guns blazing, to be able to be Walter Mitty-ish. I think that's part of everybody's, to fall into themselves. And
well, it is, but I mean, you bring it out particularly well. It's not like Jose Limon went around doing that kind of thing, and nor did you usually do that kind of thing that he did. It's something in you that came out in a very charming, sometimes very moving way in dances. So even though all the dances could be different, we could say that there is this,
I did have 4 or 5 threads that wove throughout all of my work. There was no question about that. The business of changing the Little Man thread, which was one of the first ones, was, for lack of a better word, was Chaplinesque and wistful, and always getting into, the worst things would happen to him, but he'd go through it and get on with it. There were the abstract things, which I really enjoyed most doing. But it wasn't until I got my company. I had a company concurrent with Nick's, you see. I had a little company.
And eventually they merged, finally, in 1989, right?
Well, we had to because Nick was not well. And it was too much trouble then for me to oversee his company as well as mine, and the school and this and that and him. And I gave him absolute priority, and so I condensed everything because why fight it? Go with it.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, because you were talking about how when you first started your company, this abstract thing came.
That was wonderful. You see, because until video, I never saw myself dance. Now, this may seem incredible, but I always had a vision in my head. I could visualize what it looked like. I'd be on that stage, and that was the difference between Nick and I. I could visualize how a thing looked, because I was always on the stage. And he could sit outside and design it as a total, because he could see it objectively from the outside, and I had to see it subjectively in my head. But when I began to work with a company, I could step out and see a form take place.
So you mean works like Porcelain Dialogues, that kind of work you're talking about now?
Well, the first work I did as a group thing was the very first Bach quartet that I did. It was one of the Brandenburg concertos, and I did this in 56, something of that time, 53 or 56, a very long time ago. It was called the Bach Quartet. And today I got a call from Hong Kong. Could they revive the Bach? That's done everywhere. I've made a fortune on it. You'd never think that little dance would, but I loved it. It was pure form. It was, and I'm a musical person. As a matter of fact, I studied music. I wanted to be a composer at one time. Then I wanted to be a playwright at one time. Then I wanted to be a writer at one time. And then I wanted to be a doctor at one time. I had that kind of a mind. But I knew all along I was kidding myself, because I knew I was going to dance, because I couldn't sit still. And so I fought it as long as I could. And then I just gave into it and became the dancer I always wanted to be. But
So what are some of the other threads you think runs through your work?
There was the abstract thread. There was the humor. Then there was the bizarre thread. Yes. I loved doing kooky things. And I remember I don't know if you ever saw this. It was a quartet called Suite for Divers Performers. Phyllis had the long hair and kept combing it throughout the whole piece. And I was in that big giant coat. And
I saw junk dances, of course.
And that was in the vein. Junk dances I followed the year after.
Very eccentric.
Yeah, and that was bizarre. I like that bizarre.
Also, sometimes the bizarre got sort of beautiful, like Scheherazade. That was bizarre in a different way.
I love that piece.
Yeah.
God, I love that piece. The reason I say that is because I became ambitious and I did full evening works. But when you do a full evening work and it becomes in demand, you don't do any other work because you only have so long a season in New York. Your touring only allows you to perform certain things, and I had to put it to rest because it was 3 acts, and I wasn't doing anything else. Oh, and it killed me to put that to work. I love Scheherazade.
Yeah, it was, but that was a real fantasy. You know?
Oh, I love that piece. Yeah.
So, what other kinds of ways would you characterize works of yours?
I like to do rhythmic things because I know one of the things I did when Dave Brubeck and I joined together and we toured for many years. We did world tours on this. I did the piece called the Brubeck pieces, the finale, and I did other pieces. He wrote some scores. And those were all pure forms, and I just loved them. They were quality things. They were quality things.
Yes, I remember.
All of those things came out of my training, all the training with Nick. Because if you worked in time, for example, I would lend the inevitable patina. And I hate to use the word emotion. I would like to rather use the word raga. Let me explain that. When I was in India, we were discussing with a wonderful group of Indian people, the Shankars. This is a long time ago, in the 60s. I said, in Western philosophy, we're so stuck with about 8 emotions. Pity, fear, greed, this, that, and that. Anger, and all of our dances seem to be based, all the emotional things. This is our emotional vocabulary, these 8 things. And then I discovered they said, oh, isn't that curious? We have something,
9.
we have something like 260 rasas, R-A-S-A, rasas. And they are different qualities that rest between these strong emotions. And I thought, gosh, I always knew that because I would always work in between the more obvious emotional narratives because I sensed them and everybody, and I lived them and everybody lived them and everybody knew what I was doing. And that clarified a great deal to me. It was the rasas. And so I flavored my things and I would get embarrassed doing the strong emotions. I couldn't be angry on stage. It was so corny. I couldn't love or hate. It was just not my cup of tea. It was just too overt, too melodramatic. And I prefer the subtleties of how one got into these flavors and how you drew out the flavors and how you left the flavor, the pungency, the other experiences that go with emotional excitement, all those kind of things, the whole kinetic sensation that was to be aroused in an audience, curiosity, the look. From Nick, and with Nick, I always let Nick be involved in whatever I was doing because he adored me. And if I said, no, you can't, I'd never say no to him on anything. He'd come, he'd watch the dance after I had done it. He would make his suggestions. Sometimes I'd take his advice. But when I had an electronic score or a synthesizer score, he would do it. To light my pieces, he would do it. And knowing he was going to light them and do things like that, I used light very carefully. I knew that at this moment I say, okay, Nick, I have everybody on the floor here. Could you do something where the lighting is horizontal? And then I'm going to get them up, and would you transfer that to vertical? He loved that. Because he was really involved in the pieces that I was doing. And in order to keep him happy, I I began to think very strongly of where he could contribute.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, he was the master. I mean, he lit no one else's work. I'd be insane not to have, this genius have his hand in the works. But they were mostly in ways of sound. He'd sit out there and see these. I'd come out and I'd say, "Did that work?" And he knew what I was doing, and he'd say yes, or he'd say, "We'll talk about it later," which, in junk dance, God, we were so ambitious down there. I had a 3-weekend season, and I did a premiere on each weekend, a new piece on each weekend. And the last weekend was a piece I was doing called Junk Dances, because at an auction in the country, I bid on something which I really couldn't identify. It was so strange. It was just like this lump. And I got it for $0.25. And I went up to look at it, and it was a whole collection of umbrellas. They were umbrella handles sticking out of something that wrapped them. And I thought, isn't this fantastic, these beautiful handles? Well, I got it home and opened it up, and these tatty umbrellas unfolded. And I said, that's it. I could see this piece. Junk all over, just a collection of junk, because I collected junk too, so I understood this. Junk all over the place. And, what was the point of it? When I began that piece, before I got into the telling of how I got the umbrellas, which started the piece, nuts. What were we talking about? We were talking about lighting.
Lighting, Nick, what Nick did for your pieces in the way of lighting, and how lucky you were to have somebody like that. Lighting your pieces.
Yes.
Okay.
The last weekend, this was to go on. And by then, Phyllis was my leading lady in this. And she was always she would always do kooky things, because she was. But I was the comedian. I'm really a first-rate comedian on stage when I do these things for myself. And I knew she had this comedic potential. Frankie Garcia was with me, my costumer. And I said, "Frankie, this is what this ballet is all about. It's about a lady." There's a Yiddish word called verkrimpt. Just walked around in shoes that were too big and cluck, in a tatty little house coat with a corsage, and long eyelashes which you could barely see through. And this was the wife, and she had accumulated me, the husband. She had accumulated this wonderful vase and these horrendous flowers. She had this here and she had that here, and the interior were garbage cans filled with junk, litter. And this was her home. This was, and I forgot the train of thought.
Well, we're still talking about lighting or production, or how it came about that Nick.
Oh, yes. No, we're talking about the creation of it. So I finished this piece, and I was exhausted. It was the third weekend. I'd done interims on the same program. I was really exhausted. And I took him upstairs and showed it to him. And he watched. And he had a way of holding his because he had sinus, and he had a way of pressing his sinus like this as he walked, which gave him a ferocious look. It was like he was hardly staying awake watching this. And I finished it, and I knew it wasn't working. And I was opening in 2 days. Dead, and I had to teach at 4:00. I had children's classes at 4, and this was in the morning we were doing this. He said, "Kid, I know what you want to do here, and you really could do it better. Just keep working on it." And I had the costumes and the music. I mean, as far as I was concerned, we were going to open in 2 days. And so I did. I mean, that was his advice. He said, "I know you could do better, and I know what you want to do. It's not happening. Go back and work."
So did you delay the opening? Or
No.
No, for 2 days you worked.
And everybody worked with me, though. I had a company of 4 ladies, Phyllis, the leading lady, and myself. It was a company of 5 girls and myself. And we just worked. And the first night, the curtain came down on it. I was counting madly through that whole piece. I was sure everybody was watching me. 1, 2, 5, 2, 3, 2, 4. I just knew this was going on. The curtain came down. Oh, the sigh was over. I didn't give a shit whether it was good or bad. It was over. And then the curtain went up for the bows, and that house was deafening, just deafening applause. It was, we pulled it off. That was my first triumph.
Piece, yeah.
My first triumph, and to have an audience feed you back that way after the hell I went through. It was wonderful.
Was Nick's advice always that vague, like go back and work on it, or did he sometimes say, "Well, if I were you, I'd cut this section and change that"?
It was curious. We were always very much in communion as to what we were thinking. He said, "I know what you want. I know you can do it better."
Just
and
do
so
it.
I made myself say, "What do I want? If he knows what I want, maybe I should know what I want." Do you know who did the first set for that? Bob Wilson. That was his first set in New York. Can I tell you the story about this?
Yeah, sure.
I said, "Bob, this has to be just litter." So we brought in, everybody had to save their Ajax boxes and all that garbage. And the stage was just beautiful, like a supermarket, just beautiful garbage all over the place. It was quite beautiful. And Bob did a whole set of newspapers, crinkled as a decor against the back. It was a whole set of crinkled newspapers. It was beautiful, just beautiful. Well, the thing became a hit, and I was then doing my first transcontinental tour. That meant I was going to the West Coast. That meant transcontinental, you see. But it was about six places we stopped at. But we got to the West Coast. We crossed the continent. Yes. And I had to fireproof the set because I could not take it on others. It was paper, much too dangerous. All I had to do was lean on a lamp, and it may not go up in flame, but smoke would throw an audience into panic, So everything had to be fireproofed. So we stood there, Bob and I and Nick, and they came in with like fire extinguisher or some sort of, a thing to spray the whole set. And we stood there and we watched this whole set
Just do it.
wilt into like 6 little balls all over the stage. And we just watched the set disappear. And then I had to have the set painted into a 3-dimensional set. And so it could be, the drop could go and would go. Marisol started the costumes for that. And then I got into difficulty. Marisol, the sculptor, wonderful costumes. I didn't use any of them because I had to have freedom with them. I said, no, this has to be wider. I need a pocket here because I need this and that. And you really can't do that too much with a costumer. I mean, you can do it with a set design. You can kick a hole in it and say, whoops, and then they have to fix it, you see. But with a costume, you can't tear it apart too much. But Anyway, that was Junk Dances.
You've also made now and then some extremely dramatic pieces. I'm thinking of The Station, which had a very dark,
ominous
atmosphere. You haven't made many like that, but the ones you've made were quite memorable.
I think in everyone's life you have to face major issues, and you may not face them within yourself and with the time. You may not face them when the event occurs. I think every Jewish person had to somehow face Hitler and Judaism somewhere along in their career. At least I feel this. And so I had to face it somewhere along the line. And with the ballet station, which I did only about 5 years ago, I mean, this is a long time after Hitler, I had to translate it. I had to find a way of doing it. And I simply did it as a group of people of the 30s who arrive in this station. And they were the 30s. They were an epoch. a period. And they're in the station, and they're ready to go on in their clothing and everything onto this train and go into the new epoch, into the 40s. And then they would go on and go into the 50s. And there they were in the station playing out their curious roles, getting all ready to get on the train to go to the next epoch, and the train passes them. And they're stranded in this epoch. Because I had seen, when I went back to Europe, when I went to Europe for the first time, I saw the whole 30s and 40s of European civilization stranded. They were just left suspended, those whole generations. And they had nothing to do with the 50s, nothing to do with the 50s. They were just, the world had just left them alone. And the train had gone on, and there they were. And this was the way I attempted to handle this, that the devastation he had created was so devastating that he left Europe utterly suspended in the 30s and 40s, and they could not deal with the 50s. Except the young people who were born into that could deal with it. The clothing the women wore, the attitudes, the formalities, all belonged to another period, And you would go there in the 50s, and where is this guy coming from? What is this? We had, all the smart asses were taking over the world, and look what we did with it.
Murray, I think maybe it'd be a good idea to open this to some questions now.
Oh, please.
So maybe you could bring the house lights up a little bit. Hello? Thank you. Does anybody have some questions, pressing questions you'd like to ask?
They don't have to be pressing. They can just be a question. Not one hand. The crazy thing is someone starts it, and then everyone falls into the pattern.
So somebody start and ask a very simple question like,
I'm a New Yorker. I was born and bred in New York. I learned to speak properly because I had a sister who made me sit up and enunciate. And she would just poke the middle of my back, and that's where I think where my whole vertical stature came from. I don't have any groove there to point to whether, but she would say, sit up, do this, do that. But I had a wonderful elder sister who did take care of me. I'm an orphan, and she headed the family, and she was a wonderful gal. She's still alive, and she's just marvelous, marvelous, marvelous.
You're the only person I've known who's talked about an orphanage with some affection.
Oh, I loved it. They left me alone. I did my chores just like a professional artist. You do your chores in the morning, you make your bed, you eat your breakfast, you go to school, you do this, and then I had all that time for myself. And I read. We had a wonderful library, huge library in that office. It was built like a palace. It had turrets. It's been torn down. I was brought up like a prince. I would pull that on Nick every once in a while. Watch it. You're talking to her.
Yes.
A lot. I see a great many things. I see one thing. I want to enjoy what I've done. So I'm giving myself the time now to go back into archives, to pull out these things. I had to look at this. I had forgotten all this stuff. I will do a lot of archival. I will make videos and films. When I have to relate to Nick all the time, you understand, this was this was my life. And for the last 5 years, I just made him priority. The 2 years before he passed away, when he was very ill, he was absolutely priority. I let the foundation, I let the company, I let myself just float. And the wonderful thing was, we had built such a substantial base that I could float. The ship stayed afloat. And it just went on by itself for about 5 years. I did very little. I really couldn't concentrate on anything. And now I have enormous energy. I swore I was going to retire this year. I'm going to be 70. And I swore I was going to retire. And I have a new studio. I have the archives moving in. I'm selling my house. I built a barn in the country. I did all these ridiculous things. So I have a new future. I've commissioned 2 new scores, and I have a season that will, all of November and December are taken up with performances in the New York area. I've opened up and reactivated all my European contacts and commitments, and I have a very full schedule ahead. So I've given myself the next 5 years to retire. I decided in 5 years, you're my witness. But I have a lot of new things to do. I might even dance again. I look forward to it.
Well, of course you will.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, do you know, there was a program called, it was Repertoire Workshop. CBS did Repertoire Workshop. And I did a program of my works on it. None of those were here because it was in black and white. You see, this was very awkward. I had to find colored pictures. But if I did a solo series of black and white, I'd really go way back. But they look black and white, and they look, and I had final approval of that program. I mean, I was so honored by that, who gets final approval? But somehow I had a manager, a lawyer manager who had that in the contract. We finished the whole piece, and we sat in the viewing room. And of course, if I didn't approve of this, these guys were screwed. I mean, we had to do another session. We had to redo it. And I sat there, and I watched one dance, the dance from Journal. I watched that, but done in black and white, as another showing. And I watched it. And when the whole evening was over, half hour was over, I said, Jesus, can he dance? I'd never seen myself do any of this. I was absolutely stunned. And that was the first time I saw it, and it was when video was at least able to show it to me. That was my first viewing of it. It was a wonderful experience. It was very heartening. It must have been terrible for all those artists of the 30s, never really to have seen themselves. Gosh, having gone through so much of that myself, it was a terrible feeling. But to see it, this machine is just fabulous. The only trouble about it is that it's over. I mean, 3,000 people can see one shot of it and it's over. In the old days, we could play 80 performances for 3,000 people to see us. And you kept doing it and doing it and doing it. And you learned your craft and you performed and you played and you did these things. Now, I mean, getting people out into the theaters, very difficult thing. It's a big problem for the dance today. Very big problem. So theaters are being designed smaller, which would make sense. So an artist can perhaps play 4 performances instead of one gigantic thing, you see. But then they say we can't get enough people in, so it doesn't pay your fee. It becomes a problem. Joni did. No, I never did that. No, I only used it to record. And from the very first days at the Playhouse, we would record, mostly because I wasn't everything in all of Nick's repertoire and all of my repertoire. I couldn't remember these things. We were doing concert after concert, 20 years, 40, I couldn't remember. So I had to get this down on film somehow. And in those days, having a camera was very luxurious. I mean, who had a camera in those days? And it was go, women, go, stop.
Yes.
Go, stop. Oh God!
Yes.
But this is how some of the records are in those early days.
So you can use them to revive works.
Only.
Yeah.
Only to record. And then later I realized, because one of the things I'm going to do, of all the people from the Playhouse, I'm going to go through the early films. I filmed everything. I knew I was going to use it somewhere in the future. I filmed everyone's dancing.
Beverly, Gladys, Phyllis, Bill. And when I get settled, I'm going to make a film for all of them to have of them dancing at that time when they were dancing those pieces that I was able to film of them. That's one thing I hope to do, is to let everybody know how good they were. And they were great company, great company. The gentleman who choreographs in, you know the one, very, very strong choreographer. I don't mean to sound so demeaning to him.
Choreographs where? You said choreographs in
Germany,
Forsyth?
Forsyth, yes. Now, Forsyth uses video very much to draw his material. What he does is he gets his dancers to do absolutely bizarre, one-of-a-kind things. I mean, he just gets them to move and videos it. And then they sit and look at it. He says, I want this and I want that. And they can't say, well, I can't do that because they've done it. And he corners them into doing. That's why his things are so incredibly intense and so challenging and so ferocious, because he has collected them moving in the heat of their excitement. And that's how he choreographs. He uses it very actively, very actively. No, I don't do that. No, I don't do that. Yes, dear. Oh, sweetie, he was a pussycat. I took care of him. No problem, no problem. And I had to soften him up for everyone. And they would say, do you think Nick would, what do you call it? I said, of course he would. Go and ask him, because he looked so sagacious. He was wonderful. I mean, for me, he was my buffer. He buffered me because I was really such a little hot shot, and he was always there. I never had to become older. I never had to, because he was doing that job. I kept the young part alive, and he kept the older part alive. You understand what I'm saying? It was a wonderful, and we understood each other totally, and I understood, what he needed and how I was comfortable with. But how do I say this now? He was practical. It's a terrible word. He was ingenious about everything. He could do everything with his hands. He could carpentry. He could do electricity. He could paint. He could sketch. He could play the piano. He was independent. He could do everything. And he was a fabulous cook. Big dinner parties. We had guests from all royalty and statesmen. The place was just imperial. The house always glowed with his handicrafts everywhere and the things he collected. It was, I like to read, but I always read flat on my back. So I was always in the bedroom reading. And I didn't put up with any of that. He was gregarious and overt, and I just like to be alone and read. So that's how we worked very well.
I think sometimes the mystique that certain choreographers of that generation, it was expected that they had this mystique, so that even if Nick was very friendly and approachable, that sometimes young dancers, Martha was supposed to be this, and they expected it of the choreographers to be sort of grand persons. And
although he never put it on,
Yeah,
Martha would put it on.
Yes.
She
enjoyed that.
Yeah, she was great. Absolutely, that was part of her persona. But he never played that kind of. He just looked it. Yeah, I was my own person from the very beginning. From the very beginning, when I.
Well, I mean, I think Nick took a lot from Murray. I think he drew from what you gave him, and that made that part of his choreographics.
We should explain this. You see, I was the physical body for his ideas. I'm a very intelligent person. I knew what he was saying, and I knew how to translate it into the body, into the media. And in class, for example, he would teach a principle in class. He would grope at getting at something. And I mean, he really sweat out this. He had to find what he was doing. As he got to these conclusions, I just took them as conclusions. I didn't sweat it out. I took them and did them. And that's why he would watch. The group of us would do that, you see. But for some reason, he was able to identify more with a male body because his kinetics were male, so that he would watch more. Although he drew a great deal from the other company people, particularly Beverly. He really adored that girl. Again, I shouldn't have.
Whether you adopt the manner of your mentor.
When I would finish like Friday night with a class that he may have given, or that week. Saturday, I faced all the children at the Playhouse. The children were my department, because I was the only one who could stand up to them. I was bigger than they were. I could beat the shit out of them if they made me problems, you see. They were my kids. They were Lower East Side kids. I'm a Lower East Side person. They were my kids, and we got along famously. I would take his premise from the Friday night, really an intellectual concept that hadn't really formed itself yet. I presented to those kids that morning. They did the same curriculum that the adults did. When they were successful, I was stunned. And I thought to myself, this isn't intellectual. This is natural. This is inherent. Where did this kid, because there's no television, they never saw a dance, you see. Where did this kid get this concept from? Where did this kid get this range of movement? How could this kid do this? It was intuitive. It existed in the body. Therefore, that technique was right. It was a natural technique. That was right. They didn't have to learn anything intellectual about it. They could do it. And I would bring them in sometime. I'd send one of the kids out, go out quick and get Nick. I want him to see this. They go to the big studio, run to his office and bring him in. He'd sit with me. I'd say, watch this, kiddo. And then they would do their things, and we would just, it was the thing he adored that Friday night, and which we were all doing so badly. These kids were just rattling through it. Creatively, it was a creative school, and the technique. And we suffered from that, because the word creative meant you couldn't dance. It meant the way Isadora implied that if you dance Isadora technique, you had no technique. It was that kind of mentality that associated the word creative to non-being able to dance.
I think it was the followers of Isadora, that I think she herself felt that she definitely had a technique and worked. I think it was the bad rep that the people who drifted around. I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Well, all creative people have. Look, if he's writing a symphony, he's not going to be concerned that the oboe is going to start playing a César Franck phrase. He wants him to play the phrase of that symphony. All people working with groups have to focus everybody towards the main thing. Oh, yes. Well, I think that I would really like to ask Paul to get a more pertinent one, because that was a very select thing. Nick did an outdoor thing with trees and acrobats, and I mean, he was really wonderfully diverse in doing those kind of things. It was a lovely piece. It grew out of the thing a while. They even hung from the trees. Nobody killed themselves, but they really hung from trees. What kids.
I think
Was somebody, I mean,
I think we need
No,
maybe
okay.
to stop,
Right.
even though we haven't some great. It's all been so wonderful. Murray said so many wonderful things that I don't think we need a summation of. But just thank you all for coming, and thank Murray very much for being here.
Thank you. I must say, you evoked a lot of memories. My God, you dragged me through that playhouse and through all those great dinners and all the books I read. And yeah, it was nice.
Okay.
Thank you, dolls.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.